Super Bowl. What a comeback.
All right, so the plan for tonight is pretty simple. Talk about the book Comeback, as Kelly mentioned, which is just published in June. And then maybe talk a little bit at the end about the other two books that I've written and had published, The Possible Dream and Patriot Pride. And we'll talk about what those are as well. So let's talk about this. This whole thing started in the AFC Championship game in 2015. You may remember it, the start of the game, the start of this whole situation with Deflategate and everything. Started with that game. It was a 45-7 win over the Colts. The Patriots actually outscored them 28-0 in the second half. And then suddenly there was this Deflategate controversy. The first time I heard about it, I was going into work the next morning, and Tom Brady was doing an interview on the radio. And after they did the interview, one of the radio announcers said to him, "What about this business about the air in the footballs not being as high as it should be?" And my reaction was, they must be joking, that these guys are jokers on this radio station. And Tom Brady had a similar reaction, saying, he laughed and said, "I thought I'd heard everything." So I thought this is the first time that he's heard about it as well. At least that was my view of things. That's not the view of some sports writers. So now they were accusing him of trying to laugh it off and accusing him of deflating the footballs or causing other people to do that. But then he had a press conference in which he said that he doesn't want anybody to deal with the footballs or do anything with them after he's picked them to send them to the officials. Now, I knew nothing about this beforehand, but apparently before each game, each team's quarterback picks 24 footballs and decides by the feel of them, these are the ones I want to have used in the game. They send them to the officials, and those are the ones that on each sideline are used for, in this case, the Patriots, and on the other sideline, the Colts quarterback has picked his footballs as well. And as it says here, Tom Brady doesn't want anybody tampering with the footballs after he sent them in with the right look, and not look, but the feel that he likes to have for the game. So again, another indication to me is that he wouldn't want anybody tampering with the footballs after the officials have done their thing with them as well. Then Belichick did a press conference, and he brought in some facts from people from MIT and Columbia and Carnegie Mellon talking about how the air in footballs or tires in the winter deflates in cold weather. But he mentioned that he's not the Mona Lisa Vito of the football world. If you saw the movie My Cousin Vinny, she was an expert on air tires. And this is probably the only time in football history or in Bill Belichick's experience or in any of my book talks that Academy Award winner Marisa Tomei will ever be mentioned. But she gets her due for that. All right, so that was how the whole thing started. But then the Super Bowl went on, and the Patriots made their first big comeback, coming back from 10 points behind to beat Seattle and win that Super Bowl. So let's talk about that a little bit. I'll also point out some of my favorite pictures. I always liked this view of Brady, I can't do it with the microphone, but pointing to his head to alert his receivers of what's going on. And they had a great game. Brady and the Patriots had this idea that because of the fierce Seattle defense and pass rush, they would just throw short, quick passes to try to move the ball down the field. And they did, and Brady had a phenomenal game. The picture at the bottom left of the screen is Gronkowski scoring a touchdown just before halftime. Okay, and then late in the game, they had cut the lead to 24-21. Brady led them down the field, and threw this touchdown pass to Julian Edelman that put them in the lead 28-24 after the extra point. The interesting thing about this is they had tried that on the series before, and it was a play where Edelman cuts in toward the middle and then cuts back to the sidelines, and Brady, he was open. Brady just overthrew him on that one. Then the next play, he threw a touchdown pass to Danny Amendola. Then Brady marched him down the field again and came back with that same play, and it worked, as you can see from how open Edelman is on that play. But that didn't do it. There was another weird catch by a team playing the Patriots in the Super Bowl. Seattle had a guy who had the ball tipped up in the air, and it was coming down. It hit him in the leg. It bounced up. He hit it in the air with his hand, and he caught it down at like the 5-yard line, if I remember correctly. So it looked like the Patriots were going to lose again on another miraculous catch. But then there was a play where they gave the ball to Marshawn Lynch, who was a really good running back. He took it down to the 1-yard line. Great tackle by Dante Hightower there to keep him from getting into the end zone. Then the next play, Seattle decided to throw the ball, and you all know what happened. Malcolm Butler made this interception that clinched the victory, pretty much clinched the victory for the Patriots. And there's the sequence that you can see. I hope you can see that. That's a little blurry up here, if you guys can see it. You see Russell Wilson throwing the ball, Butler cutting in front of the wide receiver and making the interception that sealed the win. Now, an interesting thing about this is the Patriots had practiced this during the week before the Super Bowl over and over and over again. And every time they practiced it, the play worked for the offense. So Malcolm Butler did not make the play. The offense scored, and had it happened again in the Super Bowl, Seattle would have beaten the Patriots and there would have been no Super Bowl win. But Butler recognized the formation, saw what was going to happen, and knew exactly what he was going to do, and as I said, cut in front of the receiver and made the interception. So whatever you may think of Bill Belichick, he certainly prepares his team very well, and they were very well prepared for this play in this game, and it certainly worked. We'll come back to that later when we talk about this year's Super Bowl. This is one of my favorite pictures, too. I was never a big Richard Sherman fan, the safety for Seattle. But at the end of the game, when Brady knelt down, Sherman immediately went over and shook his hand to congratulate him for the win. So a class move by that guy. And then the first Super Bowl celebration. This is right after the whole Deflategate thing started. So Tom Brady was pretty happy having won the Super Bowl. And the Patriots were champions in 2015. Okay, then things really started going downhill. The Deflategate thing kept picking up momentum. You may remember it led the national news every night, which I thought was crazy. There was nothing more important going on in the planet Earth during those few weeks than how much air there was in the football. But NBC, CBS, ABC, all of the cable networks were leading with the story about the air in the footballs. And then there was the Ted Wells report. I should mention that Ted Wells was a classmate of mine at Holy Cross. I guess that's a full disclosure kind of thing, because I don't agree with what he wrote. And as you may remember, the thing that he said was, there were words like, it was more probable than not that something happened with the footballs, and that he believed that it was more probable than not that Tom Brady was generally aware of the fact that the equipment people were doing something with the footballs. Now, I don't know how many of you are lawyers, but boy, this doesn't sound like anything that really sounds like hard evidence or anything that would stand up in a court of law or in a court of common sense. But more probable than not, and then the whole thing really mushroomed from there. There were hearings, there were court cases. You may remember that the NFL decided to find the Wells report found that the Patriots were not guilty of doing anything, but the Patriots were fined $1 million and lost 2 draft picks, which makes you wonder if they didn't do anything, why were they fined $1 million? And Tom Brady was suspended for 4 games. And Brady and the NFL Players Association appealed, and Roger Goodell decided that the person who was going to hear the appeal was Roger Goodell, which again does not make sense. You know, his office made the decision, he signed off on the suspension, and he was going to hear the appeal. Well, it's pretty clear what was going to happen then. He turned down the appeal, and the suspension held. So then the Players Association and Brady sued the league, took them to court, and the judge who heard the case threw out the ruling, and Brady was back able to play. Now, a couple of things there. As it says here, I'm retired, as many of you are, and I had time to do this. So I wrote a letter to the judge who was hearing the case, explaining my reasons why I thought that this ruling made no sense. To my surprise, he included that letter in the court docket about the case as well. So if that helped at all, fine. If it didn't help at all, at least, as my wife could tell you, at least I stopped ranting and raving a little bit at our house at that point. So I also wanted to point out a couple of Roger Goodell's inconsistencies in handling some other issues. There were other equipment issues. There were a couple of games, I don't remember the year, the Vikings were accused of warming the footballs on the field in cold Minnesota, and I think the Chargers were also accused of doing that in another game. And what was the penalty for them? Was it 4-game suspension and fines? No, the league sent them a letter and said, don't do that anymore. So they didn't do it anymore. Then the one that really bugged me is, you know about the cases of spousal or domestic abuse where, for example, in Ray Rice's case, They first suspended him for 2 games. He had beaten up his then fiancée in a elevator. But then when the video of what went inside of the elevator was released, then he was suspended indefinitely, which made me wonder, what did they think happened in the elevator when she walked in? There was film of her walking in, fine, and then being dragged out unconscious. But he wound up being suspended indefinitely. But there are others. Greg Hardy from Dallas was also accused of domestic abuse and was suspended for 4 games, and he beat up his girlfriend, threw her on a bed covered with rifles and guns, and he got the same suspension as Tom Brady did for maybe, possibly, convincing somebody to possibly doing something with the ear in the footballs. Doesn't make sense. And the other kind of case that I wrote to the judge about is there's a player, Ndamukong Suh, who used to play for the Lions and now plays for the Dolphins, who has, as clearly seen on TV, stomped on the legs of players on the field to try to injure them, including that same year, stomping on the leg of Green Bay quarterback Aaron Rodgers. By the way, Rodgers' leg was injured, and it was clear. You could see him, well, you can't see me behind the podium, but he stomped right on the injured leg of Aaron Rodgers, was not suspended, was not fined. The Lions were not fined. The Lions were not suspended. But, you know, the Patriots were for, well, you heard the maybe, probably, more probable than not kind of thing. So that made no sense to me. And then, even more fittingly, or ironically, I guess, this past year, another team, the Pittsburgh Steelers, was accused of using underinflated footballs. The New York Giants accused them of that. What was their penalty? Nothing. No investigation, no penalty. In fact, but there was an article in the New York Post on December 11th talking about the Giants accusing the Steelers of using underinflated footballs. There was an article the next day about the league deciding that there was nothing to investigate there and they weren't going to investigate it. And those are from 2 New York papers. But also, Sally Jenkins, who's a good writer for the Washington Post, wrote this column the week after that, and she pointed out a few things. The highlights are mine, by the way. She pointed out it leaves Roger Goodell beached and exposed. Goodell owes the Patriots and Brady an apology. Ha, like that's going to happen. Deflategate was not a fair process. You've heard the thoughts about that. And the NFL under this commissioner has 0 credibility. Well, it certainly seemed that the NFL was out to get Tom Brady and the Patriots as opposed to trying to do consistent, fair justice across the league. Now, just as another side kind of comment, I did get a phone call from Tom Brady's father during the writing of this book and all, and he called to talk about the book, which he liked reading and everything. But he also mentioned that when this whole thing happened, he said to me, when this whole thing happened, Tommy, I like that, said to me, Dad, it's not about the air and the footballs, it's about the league trying to get back at the Patriots for accusations that have been made about the Patriots in the past, some real, one real, and some not. So again, it sounded like a vendetta against the Patriots. Okay, so the judge's ruling was appealed to a 3-judge panel, and the 3-judge panel ruled 2-1 that the suspension should hold, and so Tom Brady wound up being suspended for the first 4 games of this past season. Meanwhile, a couple of other things about Goodell not being fair and the NFL not being fair. As it says at the top, the NFL tested footballs during the entire 2015 season, and they made a big deal about saying that they would reveal the results the week before that Super Bowl. But then the league refused to reveal the results. Now, that's pretty suspicious, right? If the results show that the air in footballs doesn't get decreased in cold and wet temperatures, you think the league would make a big deal out of it and say, see, we were right, and the Patriots cheated, and everything was correct. But the fact that they didn't reveal these findings says something about what the findings were. It must mean that they did not find what was to their liking, that cold air does do things to footballs. In fact, when Goodell had his press conference about this and he was asked about revealing the numbers, he said, well, the reason we did this was to deter other teams from doing things with the football, and we were successful. There was no other incident of football misuse during this season. You can form your own conclusion, but that sounds like a cop-out to me. The other thing that's not directly related to this, but the NFL has had an issue with concussions and players getting hurt, players getting concussions, players getting ALS or dementia from the hits to their head and so on. So the league was supposed to gather data about concussions. They didn't. Some of the teams did not even submit information about concussion data. And then when Roger Goodell was talking about this during that week of the Super Bowl, he talked about the fact that, well, we don't think there's a big problem with concussions. You can get just as hurt sitting on your sofa as you can playing football. There are many times during this when I want to just say baloney, so this is one of those times. I don't know about you, but when I'm sitting on my sofa at home, I don't have 300-pound linemen coming and trying to knock me down and possibly hurt me. I don't have an Ndamukong Suh trying to step on my leg or anything, too. And one of the owners, in fact, the owner for the Indianapolis Colts, talked about the fact that even taking an aspirin is dangerous. That's their baloney factor again. I also talk about the fact that a 7th grader in Lynn, Massachusetts, I think, did a science project that year where he took NFL footballs, inflated them to a particular level, then submitted them to cold and wet conditions, and what he found was that the air in the footballs deflated. So this 7th grader did a better job than the NFL. And the NFL in the Wells report was 258 pages or something like that. This guy had like an 8-page science fair project that proved that air does get decreased in enclosures during cold and wet conditions. Okay, enough of that for a while. So this is before the suspension. Let's go back to that. The 2015 season, the Patriots, looking for revenge, fell 2 points short against Denver in the championship game. In fact, they tied the game late in the game. It was 20-18. They went for 2 points, which would have tied the game and sent it into overtime, but they missed the 2-point conversion with 12 seconds to go, and so lost to Denver, and Denver went on to play in the Super Bowl and beat Carolina. This will come to play later on because last year, after missing that 2-point conversion, every week the Patriots practiced 2-point conversion plays. And if you remember, and as you'll see in a few minutes, those 2-point conversions were big plays in the Super Bowl this past February. So a couple of pictures down here. The one on the bottom left is sort of a tribute that the Patriots did to Tom Brady the week that he was serving the suspensions. They put these pictures of Tom Brady up on the light tower that you are probably familiar with at Gillette Stadium, and you could see these. They put them on all sides of the tower. You could see these from Route 1. Tom Brady, during his suspension, anytime anybody went to visit with him, he asked them to go practice with him, so he'd throw footballs to Wes Welker or anybody who came to visit, including a picture posted by Gisele Bundchen on her Instagram account of him throwing footballs to her. And then the season started. The Patriots went 3-1 with Jimmy Garoppolo. How am I doing pointing at this stuff? With Jimmy Garoppolo filling in for the first couple of games, then Jacoby Brissett after that. Hope I'm not boring you. I'll try to make it more interesting from this point on. All right, so Brady served his 4-game suspension, came back in week 5, and the Patriots went 14-1 after that. That's pretty good. And then the ultimate comeback was in the Super Bowl, and you all know this. They overcame a 25-point deficit late in the third quarter. Atlanta had a 28-3 lead with like 8.5 minutes to go in the third quarter. The Patriots scored 25 points from that point on to tie the game. Brady led them on a touchdown drive and tied the game with only 57 seconds left. They had 2 2-point conversions. Remember how they lost the year before to Denver because they couldn't convert a 2-point conversion? It's hard to convert a 2-point conversion. The fact that they did it twice, again, is testament to how well prepared Belichick had the team during the year. And then Brady led a game-winning touchdown drive in overtime with terrific passes. If you ever see the replay of this, the passes are all different, all the different receivers, and all terrific. There's one looping pass to Danny Amendola on the right sideline. Then he throws a comeback pass to Chris Hogan on the left sideline. And then he throws a pass to Julian Edelman right in the middle of the field with 2 defenders right around him. To this day, I have no idea how Brady got the ball into Edelman without it being knocked down or anything happening there. But they did it. So the Patriots won. They won their 5th Super Bowl. Got these nice and gaudy rings for that. You see that Tom Brady when they got the rings at the celebration for that, there's Brady posing with the 5 championship rings that he has. Brady's the first quarterback to win 5 Super Bowls, first player to win the Super Bowl MVP 4 times, and Belichick's the first coach to win 5 Super Bowls. Now, I don't know if you can see, but inside the ring for this year, it says greatest comeback ever. And each ring that the players got has 283 diamonds in it. Why 283? Because of the 28-3 score that they came back from. Now, considering that the final score in that game was 34-28, I thought if Bob Kraft has the money, he should have had each ring have 3,428 diamonds in it. But it's his money, not mine. All right, so a couple of the key plays from that game. With Atlanta ahead 28-12, again, Dante Hightower, you may remember him making a big play in the Super Bowl in 2015, made another big defensive play, sacking Matt Ryan and causing a fumble that the Patriots recovered, and that led them to the touchdown that made it 28-20. Then a key play of the game, we'll talk about Julian Edelman later, and I think what his loss is going to be a big loss for the Patriots. Key play of the game, with 2:28 to go, Patriots were down by that 28, I think that was 28-12 actually at the time. And this is the time that the Patriots were able to make a miraculous catch. You see a couple of the shots of it here. You know, Edelman was being guarded by 3 defensive players. The ball was tipped by them. He reached down, he sort of bobbled it in his hands, and then made this catch. And as you can see in this picture, caught the ball just inches before it hit the ground. So that kept the drive alive, and the Patriots were able to score and tie the game. This is my absolute favorite picture from this Super Bowl. So Edelman's making this catch, and of course the Atlanta people wanted to review it to see if it was a catch or not. So they're showing it at the Jumbotron at each end of the field. And you see the Atlanta defender pointing to one end and saying, no, it fell to the ground, it's an incompletion. And Edelman saying, no, look, I caught it. And of course, the catch was upheld, and the Patriots went on to score the touchdown. 2 two-point conversions run on 2 different plays. The first 2-point conversion was a direct snap to James White, who then ran it. You see Tom Brady jumping up and pretending that the ball was snapped over his head to try to fool the defenders. Meanwhile, James White ran it in. That made it 28-20. Patriots scored again, making it 28-26 with 57 seconds left in the game. And then Brady threw a pass to Danny Amendola that he just got in and scored the 2-point conversion that made it 28-28. So 2 great plays and 2 plays that they couldn't have done without if they were going to win the Super Bowl. I mentioned the fact that there were 4 perfect passes from Brady. I didn't talk about the one to James White. That was just a flip to the left side to start the drive. His next pass was to Amendola. His next pass was to Hogan. His next pass was to Edelman. Then he threw a pass into the end zone to Martellus Bennett, but Martellus Bennett was interfered with at the 1-yard line, which set them up for, which would be the game-winning touchdown. Scored by James White on a pitch out, and he ran it into the side. And again, you can see that he really fought his way into the end zone to tie the score. So 28-28 at that point. And I have it on good authority, Debbie specifically, that this was also one of the 2-point plays that they practiced during the season. Again, to be prepared for situations like this. Again, some good pictures, I think. James White celebrating in the end zone on the left, and LeGarrette Blount, who was on the sideline at the time, raced as fast as he could to the end zone to be the first person to congratulate James White. Patriots have good teamwork, and this is, again, an example of that kind of thing. So then victory, and what I said was total vindication in 2017, Brady and Belichick celebrating, Brady and Bob Kraft celebrating, Brady getting the trophy, and regardless of what had happened with Deflategate, regardless of what had happened with the controversy, he wound up being a winner. This is the Brady family celebrating after the Super Bowl. That is Tom Brady Sr., the man who called me and then sent a copy of my book to Tom, or Tommy, as he calls him. This is Tom Brady's mother, who you may remember during Super Bowl week, we heard that she had cancer. I had actually heard that from Tom Brady Sr. when he called me earlier in the year, and I told him I wasn't going to tell anybody about that because it was his news to pass on. But he also indicated that he thought that the stress of Deflategate really exacerbated her condition and maybe made her worse. So this was the first game that she went to all year was that Super Bowl, and that's unusual for her and her husband because they usually go to at least a few games during the year. If you're Red Sox fans with sharp eye, you might notice the guy in the top right of this picture. Former Red Sox player Kevin Youkilis, who married one of Tom Brady's sisters, and obviously was there on the field to help celebrate. I told you there were 2 other books. I'll just talk briefly about them. The first one that was published in 2005 was The Possible Dream and How the Red Sox Reversed History. It started in 2003. I'd actually had some surgery in 2003 and I hadn't been watching baseball for a while. And I started watching baseball again while I was recuperating. And I started, as I am wont to do, to go, oh, they're doing the same thing they always do. They don't know how to run their pitching staff, blah, 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 blah. And my wife got this look in her eyes like, oh no, I'm not gonna have to listen to this all over again, am I? So I decided I'd write it down. So I was lucky enough to have a couple of publishers interested in that, and one of them, well, by the way, the book was divided into 2 parts. Why they hadn't won in 86 years was the first part, and the second was what they had to do in 2004 in the future to finally win. But then the publisher that I chose asked, what happens if they win it next year? So he and I agreed that I would keep a month-by-month diary of the 2004 season in case something happened. Well, something did happen. They did win, which meant that that second section went right out the window. But in my defense, and I'll have to, you can ask Margie later if I had not said this before, but they did some of the things that I had suggested, like getting better pitching. Curt Schilling, you may remember, came to the team and was coming to break an 86-year-old curse. You also may remember that they picked up Dave Roberts in midseason because the Red Sox traditionally didn't have speed, but they had it, and Dave Roberts stole a key base in the playoffs to help them win the game. But why didn't they win for 86 years? Some of the factors that I talk about, bad trades, bad transactions. You all know about the fact that they had Babe Ruth and decided to sell him to the Yankees. That certainly sent them down to a spiral for many of those years. But they also made some other bad trades. They traded Sparky Lyle to the Yankees. Sparky Lyle went on to win the Cy Young Award as the best pitcher in the league. And they traded him to the Yankees for Danny Cater. And their explanation was, well, Danny Cater always hits well in Fenway Park. Of course he did. He was facing Red Sox pitching at Fenway Park. So. With the Red Sox, I think his batting average was probably something like 203 or something like that. So he did not do well with the Red Sox. In 1978, when they blew a 14-game lead, they sold Bernie Carbo at midseason and got nothing in return that they could use on the field. That year, you may remember, they were in a playoff game with the Yankees. Maybe Bernie Carbo could help them win a game down the stretch that they otherwise wouldn't have. Maybe they wouldn't have been in the playoffs, and maybe they would have been in the World Series. All right, I'm belaboring this a little bit. Poor ownership. They lost Carlton Fisk, Hall of Fame catcher, the best catcher in their history, because they didn't send him a contract in time. Who loses an all-star player because you don't send him a contract on time? But the Red Sox did. They had bad managers. My kids know that you don't want to mention the name Don Zimmer in my presence. I mentioned it to you guys, but I think it's the worst manager that the Red Sox ever had. You also may remember in 2003, Grady Little leaving Pedro Martinez in too long, and they lost the game against the Yankees that could have sent them to the World Series. Sorry for bringing up all the bad memories. But there were some other things. As it says there, they passed on the opportunity to sign some key players who might have helped them. They had the first opportunity to sign Jackie Robinson. They had him for a tryout at Fenway Park, and the Red Sox at that time, there was some racism in the organization. So when they were doing the tryout with Jackie Robinson, there was somebody in the stands and yelled, "Get those blank off the field." There were 3 black players who were trying out for the Red Sox. So Jackie Robinson instead signed with the Dodgers. Red Sox also had a minor league affiliate in Birmingham, Alabama, and they sent a scout down to scout a guy who was playing for the Birmingham Barons of the Negro League, a fellow by the name of Willie Mays. And the scout decided, I'm not going to go down and see that. So he just sent in a report that said, this guy Mays will never make the major leagues. Well, he did. Willie Mays, for years, had, I think, the second highest total of home runs in baseball history. And he hit 600 home runs, and many people think he was the best player of his generation. So this is what might have been. Could have had Babe Ruth, best player in baseball history. Could have had a team that had Ted Williams, Jackie Robinson, Willie Mays. They also had a chance to sign Pee Wee Reese. So they could have had Williams, Mays, Robinson, Pesky, Dominic DiMaggio, I'm missing somebody, Bobby Dorr, and maybe they would have actually won in all those years, but they didn't. But finally, 2004 happened, and they finally reversed the curse, thanks to people like Pedro Martinez, David Ortiz, Tim Wakefield, and that great stolen base by Dave Roberts in the playoff game against the Yankees. Okay, that's the first book. Second book was Patriot Pride. I'm almost done, by the way. It talked about the 50-year history of the Patriots, and the Patriots for 40 years were almost like a laughingstock in the league. They were, as it says, they're a mediocre team with an unusual history. And we can talk about some of these stories later if you want. Some of you guys have heard these stories. They had an instance in their early history where a fan ran onto the field, unseen by the referees, interfered with a player who was going to be catching the ball. The player didn't catch the ball. It fell into the end zone, and the Patriots won the game. And in fact, most of the players didn't know until the next day that that had happened when they were looking at the films and just started laughing, pointing at this guy. But it helped them win. This is a good story that we can talk about later if you want. Another fan called down from the stands to suit up for the opening day kickoff. They had a coach almost electrocute himself at an introductory press conference. When they built what was then, it was first Schaefer Stadium, then it became Sullivan Stadium, then it became Gillette Stadium, then it was torn down, and they built Gillette Stadium. I said that wrong, I think. It was Foxborough Stadium. But when they first built the stadium and had the first exhibition game, the traffic on Route 1 was horrible. People were abandoning their cars and walking to the stadium. A lot of them missed the first half. Then at halftime, people do what people do. They all went to the bathroom. And the water level in Foxborough dropped to a level that the fire department felt was too low. So they said, you got to fix this before you have another game there. So the next Saturday, they had what they called the Big Flush Test. And they invited people to come in, and at the sound of some horn over the PA system, they flushed every toilet, every urinal, turned on the water in every sink, just to convince the Foxborough Fire Department that the water pressure could be high enough for them to be able to play the games. It worked. They played a home game in Birmingham, Alabama. A lot of you probably remember the snowplow game where a guy came out and plowed a spot where they could kick a field goal and beat the Dolphins 3-0. So this was the Patriots for the first 40 years of their history. That was the 20th century. In the 21st century, they became a dynasty, and in fact, they became the model franchise that other organizations in the NFL and in other sports tried to emulate. You may remember the first time they won the Super Bowl, they came out introduced as a team, which nobody had heard of before. Before that, people were introduced individually. And some people said when they saw the Patriots being introduced as a team, they thought, I was convinced then that they were going to win the game. And they were, the darlings of the sports world, how things change. The success they had, the success that Belichick's had, success that Brady's had, the fact that Brady's married to a supermodel who's very super rich supermodel, I think generated a lot of jealousy around the sports world. So anyway, the book also includes interviews with a number of key people in Patriots history, including the list that you see there: Drew Bledsoe, Troy Brown, John Morris, Gino Cappelletti, Steve Grogan, and a whole bunch of people. That was actually the best part of the book, was the interviews with these guys. So the interviews, the questions that I asked them: what was their first thought when they found out that they were going to the Patriots? And there were some interesting comments there. What was their most memorable game? What was the game or play that they would like to redo if they could? Who was their toughest opponent? Who was a player that they wish they'd play with? And I would also say, well, I'm going to give you a name of a player you played with or against, and I want you to tell me something about that player. And some of those were revealing. Drew Bledsoe, for example, talked very highly about Tom Brady and what a great guy he is. And considering the fact that Brady is the guy who took Drew Bledsoe's job, I thought that was pretty classy on Drew Bledsoe's part. John Hanna, who had a reputation for being a real surly guy who didn't get along with a lot of people, at one point I brought up the name Russ Francis to him, and he said something about Russ Francis and then said, wait a minute, you'd better not print that. And so he then told me something else, and that's what I printed. And I still won't tell you what he told me the first time, by the way. And again, if we have time, and we may not, there's some interesting interview stories. I got the interview with Drew Bledsoe thanks to his mother. I interviewed Troy Brown at his house, which was interrupted by a visit by the police. I've gotten some handwritten responses from Raymond Berry, who's a real classy guy, was a former Baltimore Colt, and he was the coach of the Patriots when they first went into the Super Bowl. Who writes handwritten notes these days? But I just got another one from him a couple of weeks ago about this book. But in one of the books, I interviewed him for the Patriot Pride book, and he sent me a note a few years later saying, I was moving things around in my office and I came upon your book. I wanted to read the part about me again, and I have 2 questions for you. First is, will you do a eulogy for me? The second is, where were you when I was negotiating my contract? Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming and spending the time doing this.